Ya, ahora sí, ¿ya? Listo.
So thank you so much for this interview, and can you please tell us just a little bit about you and your book as an introduction, please?
Yes, thank you for having me. My book is called Mischling, and it's about two 12-year-old girls who are twins, and they're sent to Auschwitz and are subjected to the experience of Joseph Mengele. And the book is about their efforts to survive and how they take a sort of refuge in their bond, their very relationship, how it helps them endure. And I was drawn to this story because my family mercifully was able to escape Poland in 1932. By that date, all of my family had immigrated to the United States. They were so they were safely, they were far from these atrocities. And I was always haunted when I was growing up by images of the war and what had happened, what became of Poland, what became of the people who weren't lucky like my family and were able to get out. So this book was sort of gestating in my head for a very long time before I actually started to write it. It was a preoccupation from the time that I was about 16 years old when I first found the story of the twins. And I never really intended to actually write a book about it, but as a child who lived in their head a great deal, my imagination just was completely focused on a sort of conversation between the twins, how they might speak to each other as they went about their day, how they might acknowledge the sort of pain and torment that Mengele was inflicting upon them, and how too they would acknowledge their relationship, their family, their memories, all of the elements that play into how one survives something of this magnitude. I mean, it's an unspeakable kind of horror, and yet when you read the testimonies of survivors, there's often a focus on the relationships that help them.
And we've been talking about, in the past 2 nights about this event that it's huge. I mean, I don't know how much time do we need to heal all that damage, and we're in the door of the probable third world. So probably your book is trying to remember that story that needs to be told once and again. But from your perspective and from your readers, what is the context of telling that story? I mean, I know it's fiction, but what is different from telling it now in this technological and political and all the context of today?
Well, it's startling because the time that I was writing the book, the majority of it, and when I was editing it, by the time I imagined it actually being published, things had drastically changed in America. Hate language has always been around, racism has always been prevalent, but suddenly it became very acceptable, enabled by the Trump administration, to say certain things. Racists and white supremacists were no longer terrified. To me, that was a horrifying thing to witness. And so I think that this book, I would like it to always function as a sort of remembrance and a callback to the testimonies of direct witnesses. I think that that's its main function. It's also titled after, its title is a reference to a term that was used by the Nazis to denote persons of mixed race, people who were not Jews who had other types of blood. And that sort of focus, that obsession on purity is very dangerous. And so I think it was important to me to put that at the fore, to say, this does not lead anywhere that we want to go again. We need to check our language. We need to find a way to treat each other with a regard that is careful and never, even casual conversation, you need to be aware of what you're saying. Dehumanization is a large concept, but it starts very small. It starts with how we treat each other, how we speak. And so while this book is a very, very small part of that conversation, I do hope that it can maybe lead people back to history, lead some people back to history, mostly new readers who might not be aware of it. It's a very specific story, very small, because the scope of this event is so, I mean, we still can't really define its boundaries. It's an ever-present shadow. But that's the world I imagine perhaps is
Because we know about Second World War from pieces, you know, we've been like putting all the pieces together because we didn't have a way to record every single thing. So we are still discovering things that happened, you know, in those years. But now we have a very exquisite and obsessive record, digitally and physical, of how we've been abused, even in those words, you know, in the comments on the digital. So how are we writing the new story and with violence and, you know, with all this, how these children now are growing with that idea and living, you know, in different worlds, but building the new story that, you know,
the sort of digital remembrance of
yes,
what's happening. I mean, I think it's a really fascinating topic. When I went to the Auschwitz Museum for our conference, much of the conversation did drift in the direction of how do we present this history to young people, and also how do we properly memorialize this on the internet? How can we feel about putting images, these extreme, that are tied to so many innumerable deaths beside the sort of stuff of our everyday life? There's a sort of question of appropriateness, and yet we also feel as if it should be a daily remembrance. For so many people, they don't have a choice about what day they're going to remember. International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which very recently occurred, that's every day for many people. One of the most startling things is meeting grandchildren of survivors and finding that these traumatic effects hardly diminish with the generations. I mean, their lives, they process it differently, but they are still very much affected, and are, you know, so many of them make an effort to become living monuments to their parents and grandparents survivors.
so what do you think we need to build, you know, as a conclusion to be a better humanity from your perspective?
I think that I'm hardly the person to answer this, because I believe in questioning. It's a huge part of the Jewish tradition, and so I think honoring questioning is important. Free speech is important. We need to be able to draw on details of what happened without any sort of fear of repercussion. The Polish Parliament recently passed a law criminalizing certain language about Poland and the Holocaust, and I think this is extremely damaging, and I'm Polish. And I think it needs to be open. It needs to be an open conversation in all things. I can't approach the question of how to become a better human race, but I do think that it does start there with a certain openness and a willingness to have a conversation with each other and respect each other. And it saddens me that that's even something that we need to remind each other of often. Kindness should be a reflex, and I'm not quite certain where that went wrong in everyone. It's obviously wrong in me too sometimes, but I do think a certain awareness is necessary. It's the only way to go there. But it's a large question that I feel like it's why people get into literature, because they're dealing with questions like that. And start focusing on very small stages in which they might explore these big moral questions.
And to finish, are you writing on
writing something else. I think I wouldn't know myself if I wasn't writing, but it is chaos. I mean, the title of it could be chaos right now because it is all notes and fragments, and it's honestly a little discouraging to be setting out again because I'm finding that I'm still obsessed with the same things that you just referenced with your question that I'm obviously still struggling with. So yeah, it's an interesting process. Who knows where it's going to lead? I'm just happy to be able to do it, to write. It's a very playful process for me, even as I'm looking at things that are uncomfortable and squirmy. And so yes, I'm still in that dark terrain.
They say that that's art. What's the thing that make you uncomfortable?
I would love to write a comedy. I really would, and I tried to many times after I first finished this book. I am going to write a comedy, and I have many friends who are comedians. I think that's why I was able to write this book because I had people around me that were making me laugh constantly, and I'm so grateful for that.
That's another way to transform it.
It's true. So while I wish that I was writing a comedy, it's not so for me. There will always be little moments of humor and hopefully charm in my work, but someday, that's my big lofty goal, is to make something that makes everyone just laugh.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for this interview.
Thank you.
Have a nice day.
Oh,
Ya, muchísimas gracias.